Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual training event. My name is Dan Painter. I am the Product Training and Development Manager here at Flint & Walling, and I will be hosting today's broadcast. A couple of things just before we do get started of note. One, if you've looked at our web conference schedule posted on our website, next Wednesday, January 26th, we'll be doing a presentation entitled The House of Resistance. And for those that may wonder, what in the world is that all about? It is a pump sizing model that is pretty unique, and it's great. It's a great tool, easy to remember, and it will assist in sizing above ground pumps, jet pumps, centrifugal pumps, self-priming pumps, and it gets you to a selection very, very quick. Later in March, I believe it's in March, I'm going to be introducing a new presentation, and it's called The House of Resistance for Subs. So we'll have two sizing models here before the quarter's out, one for above ground pumps, jets, and centrifugals, and then the other one coming in the latter part of March or February. I can't remember. It's on the website. It's going to be for submersible pumps. The other thing, if you notice on your dashboards, there's a section there that's tabbed. You should have several tabs there. One is referred to as handouts. Next week, I will be putting a couple of PDF files in that handout section. One will be a copy of the presentation, and the other one will be a worksheet. There's also a survey in there. So if you happen to feel like when we're done today, if you feel like you would like to take that short survey, we certainly would appreciate it. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today's topic is about above ground home and irrigation pumps 101. So the whole notion of this presentation is to train and educate you so that you can identify these various above ground pumps without the need of looking at a model number, without the need of referring to a catalog, simply by just looking at the pump, a visual inspection of the pump. If I do my job today, it should be a trigger so that as soon as you see the pump, you'll know, hey, that's a self-primer, or hey, that's a shallow well jet, just by a visual inspection. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Get my triggers here to work okay. Let's see. There we go. I'm going to pull a highlighter up here real quick. Okay, so it's not uncommon. We're going to talk about what you're going to hear today a lot frequently is two types. When we get a brand new person coming into the industry, I'll start them off this way. I'll say there are two types of pumps associated typically with the water well and the irrigation industry. Well, one is pictured on the left-hand side of your screen, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And these are what's called above ground pumps. And of course, the second type of pump that's typically used is referred to as submersible. I have sessions coming up in the web conference schedule that will go into submersible pumps in a pretty good detail. But today, like I said, we're going to talk about above ground pumps. And in so doing, two types is something you're going to hear me say quite frequently. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with above ground pumps. There's two types. So when we look at above ground pumps, we're going to categorize these into two categories. One is going to be referred to as jet pumps. And then, of course, the second category will be referred to as centrifugal pumps. And again, the whole objective behind this web conference today is to be able to look at these pumps visually and identify what type of pump they are. So with that, we're going to start off talking about jet pumps. Now, I'm actually conducting this web conference from our training center, and I don't have the luxury of a preview slide, so I'm going to see these slides kind of come up at the same time you all do. But when we talk about jet pumps, okay, when you look at a well, and that's where the majority of jet pumps are going to be used. They're typically used on well systems. If you had a house in the country back in the 50s or 60s and you had a jet pump, that's how you got water in. But the thing that I want to talk to you about here when we talk about above ground pumps, and particularly when they're used on a well, If you call me and want assistance in sizing a pump, and you've got a well, one of the first questions I'm going to ask is how far is it from the surface down to the water level in that well? How far is it? And that's going to be a vertical measurement, and it's going to be measured in feet. So, for example, if that distance is 25 feet or less, all right, if it's 25 feet or less, that's going to be referred to as a shallow well. That's not a Dan Painter term. That's an industry standard term that most every pump company acknowledges. And so when we talk about shallow wells, what we're talking about is a well where the water level is less than 25 feet from the top of the well, from the top of the surface. All right, so that's a question I'm going to ask. The second, obviously, question is if it's more than 25 feet, if that water level is more than 25 feet away, then this well is going to be referred to as a deep well. So therein lies the difference between what is defined as a shallow well and what is defined as a deep well. And these are important to know when sizing and selecting above ground pumps. So less than 25 feet is a shallow well, more than 25 feet is a deep well. Now, circling back on our first topic of above ground pumps, we're talking about jet pumps. So why is this important to know? You know, why is it important to know how far, how much distance there is to water, whether it's a shallow well or a deep well? Well, there's two types of jet pumps. There is a shallow well jet pump, and there's a deep well jet pump. So I'm going to circle back on that in just a second, but here's a question that I get asked occasionally. Why are they called jet pumps? You know, and sometimes I've asked that question. Here in our training center, pre-COVID, we'd have this place loaded with 30, 40 people in here. And I'd throw that out there. I'd say, hey, anybody in this group know why a jet pump's called a jet pump? And I had an old boy raise his hand in the back of the classroom one day, and he said, hey, Mr. Painter, I know why they're called a jet pump. And I said, why is that, sir? He said, well, did you ever hear one run? I kind of chuckled at that, and I said, well, I'm not sure where you're going with that. He said, well, it sounds like a damn jet. I'm thinking, well, he's not talking about our jet pump, because ours is the most quiet thing you'd ever hear run. So, yeah, everybody's got their own perception, and I'll be honest with you, this is an opinion I have. But if we look at why they call a jet pump, it's because the pump must be accompanied with one or the other of the two components showing up on the right-hand side of your screen. These are called jets. Some old timers like myself might refer to these as ejectors, but nonetheless, there's two types of jets. There's a shallow well jet pump, and then there's a shallow well jet, and then there's a deep well jet. So up the top here is the shallow well jet. If you look, it bolts right onto the front of the pump. So move over to the left-hand side of your screen. You can see that this shallow well jet or shallow well jet adapter bolts right to the front of the pump. And that's what makes that a shallow well jet pump, where the other one down below is referred to as a deep well jet. The shallow well jet's mounted horizontally. The deep well jet is going to be located much further down where that water source is at. And so in that case, it'll be mounted vertically in the well. So I'm going to get back to that here in just a second. But that's why I want to know how far is it to water, so I know which jet pump to pursue, whether it's going to be a shallow well jet pump or a deep well jet pump. So those are your two ejectors. These are jets, and they must accompany the pump in order for the pump to be able to lift water out of the well and pump water into the home. And so these jets are as a component. Maybe that's a reason why they call that thing a jet pump. It's just an opinion. So how do they work? How do these jet pumps work? Right. So I think everybody has done this before, right? Everybody's had a length of garden hose in their hand, whether you're standing out in the backyard. And everybody's seen what I've got up on the picture on the screen right now. You know, in fact, when I was a young kid, that was our number one drinking fountain right there. But so everybody knows what this is all about. How many times have you ever done this? all right? You put your thumb over the end of that garden hose. Sometimes when I'm in classroom, I stand in front of the classroom and I'll kind of role play. I'll tell the folks, I'll say, look, if there was a hose bib in this wall behind me and I put a four foot piece of garden hose on there and I open that hose bib all the way up, my guess is all you guys in this front row, you're going to get soaked. I can soak you all down. But back there in that second row, third row, I may get you from the waist down, from the knees down. It all depends on how much pressure's coming out of that valve. But if I put my thumb over the end of that garden hose, and everybody's, like I said, everybody's done this, now nobody in this classroom would be safe. I could shoot that water all over the whole entire classroom, soak everybody. So what happened then when I put my thumb over the end of that garden hose? What changed? Here's what changed. I increased the velocity of that water coming out the end of that garden hose, all right? I increased the velocity of the water by restricting the opening coming out the end of that garden hose. Now, I'm thinking at this point, you're wondering, what the heck does this have to do with pumps? Well, let me give you one example, all right? I've done, make a little confession to you, I'm the father of 10 children. So I, in my time, have done 10 science fair projects. Let me explain one science fair project, because this is going to tell you how a jet pump can lift water out of a cistern, out of a well, whatever, all right? I took a piece of 3/4 inch copper pipe. I don't know, this was probably 14 inches long. I drilled a hole in the top of it, and I pushed a nozzle into that copper pipe, right? I pressed a nozzle into the end of that, in the inside of that copper pipe. Now, where that hole's drilled at the top, I inserted a piece of copper tubing. I kind of soldered it in there. So I created a Y-looking device here with a nozzle pressed on the inside of it. I brazed a hose bib fitting on the end of that piece of copper pipe, and we put a garden hose on the end of that, and we walked this thing out in the backyard. All right, I can't remember if it was one of my sons or my daughter. I can't remember, but we opened up that hose bib. And so that water come running through the hose, and it entered into that piece of copper pipe. And then once it got to that nozzle, we basically mirrored what was happening when you put your thumb over the end of that garden hose. That nozzle also restricts that opening. And as a result of that, it created velocity. We were shooting that water out of that little piece of copper tubing, 3/4 inch copper tube. We were probably shooting that out there 40 or 50 feet. But I asked my son or my daughter at the time, I said, hey, while this is shooting all that water out over the grass, I want you to put your finger over that little tube. Go ahead and do that. Put that finger over that little tube. Do you feel anything? And the response was, holy crap, yes, it's like a little vacuum cleaner. I can feel it wanting to suck my finger right down into that tube. Here is the lesson. Velocity will create a suction or a vacuum. Let me give you more of a dated example of that. You know, if I were in a car running down an interstate highway, and this is a little dated, and all the windows were up in the car and I lit up a cigarette, all right? It wouldn't take 2 or 3 puffs and that whole car would be filled with smoke, right? I think everybody's probably experienced that at some point. On the other hand, while I'm running down that highway with a car filled with smoke at 60, 70 miles an hour, all I really need to do is just crack the window a little bit. Don't have to roll it down, just crack it a little bit and watch what happens. You'll start to see all that smoke being pulled out of the car through that crack of that opening in the window. Why? Because you have a tremendous amount of velocity in the form of air moving past the opening in that window when you're running down the highway at 60 miles an hour. And like I said, it'll create that suction effect or that pulling effect. We see this in racing all the time. If you're a race fan, you know, these cars will come right back up on the back side of one another, you know, and it's the lead car's the one that's doing all the work. The one that's right behind him, he can get off the gas. He's being pulled by that lead car. And so anyway, suction creates, velocity creates suction. All right, so let's look at this jet. All right, let's just look at this jet. As you can see, inside these jet assemblies, there are nozzles pressed in there, right? There are nozzles in there. So here's what happens when we take this jet assembly and we bolt it onto this pump, all right? If you look at the front of the pump, there are two openings here, one at the top, one at the bottom. If you look closely enough, and if my images are coming through clean enough, those openings actually have female threads inside of them. You can see that. But in the case of a shallow well, where we're going to take this shallow well jet and bolt it up to that pump, it'll bolt right up to that pump. Here's what a lot of people, I don't think some people even know this occurs on a jet pump. But again, I mentioned those two openings. When that pump is up and running and it's pumping water, and of course the bulk of that water is going to come out the discharge into the home, right? The bulk of the water is going to come right out the discharge of that pump into the home water system. But a small portion of that water that pump is pumping is not going to go to the house. It's going to come out that bottom opening that you see where that blue arrow's at. And so a portion of the water coming out of that jet pump is actually coming out that bottom opening. Why do we do that? Because that water coming out that bottom opening is going to enter into this jet assembly that you see here. It's going to make a U-turn at the end, and it's going to be forced through that nozzle and that venturi, which creates the velocity, which pulls the water behind it. So you've got this water from the well or from the cistern that's being pulled in as this nozzle creates that velocity. So that's that pulling effect. One thing I'll mention is I'll just bring this up because it's on my mind right now, but I'd tell a contractor who sells a lot of, anybody that sells jet pumps. If you have a jet pump that, let's say, is pumping very little or no water at all, the very first place I would suggest that you look is that nozzle. So in the front where my cursor is at right now is what's called a clean-out plug. So this plug can be removed, and if any debris or anything foreign would happen to get lodged in that nozzle, listen, if you plug that nozzle, if that nozzle is plugged or partially plugged, then you don't create the velocity that you need. And if you don't create the velocity, you don't get the suction, and of course, then you don't get the pumping. And so that clean-out plug is there so that should that happen, you can take that clean-out plug, go in with a piece of copper wire, and hopefully be able to dislodge whatever may be in that nozzle without having to take this jet off the front of that pump. So that's what that's called right up front here. That's called a clean-out plug. And again, like I said, most of the water that pump's going to pump is going to go to service, to the house, to the home, where they need it. But there will always be a portion of that water that's going to come through this bottom opening, make this U-turn, and this is what's called drive water. That's the technical term, but this drive water is what's going to make that jet create that velocity to create that suction. On a deep well jet, all right, so in the case of a deep well jet, there's going to be two pipes running to the water source, all right? So we're going to hook a pipe up to that bottom opening, which is going to be the drive water, which is what's going to run down into the well near where the water level's at, and it's going to make that U-turn. This assembly is what creates that suction. So if that water is further than 25 feet away, the device that creates the suction, we better get it a little closer to that water source if we expect this pump to be able to work. So the bottom tapping of that pump there is going to tie into this deep well jet. And again, the top one is where the water is going to come out and discharge. So it's very similar to having this jet bolted right to the pump, but in this case, we have to push it down closer to the water source to get the water out of the well. And so we have to run two pipes down to that. So therein lies a big difference between a shallow well jet and a deep well jet. With a shallow well jet, you have one pipe that runs to the water source. That's it, just one pipe. But with a deep well jet, you got two pipes. There's your visual. So if you see a pump with two pipes coming off the front of it, that's going to be a deep well jet pump. If it's just got the one, like you see on the left, that's a shallow well pump. And of course, all above ground pumps pulling water from wells, pulling water from cisterns, pulling water from lakes, they all need to have this device on the bottom of that suction line called a foot valve. A foot valve is very much like a check valve, if you know how that operates. A check valve and or a foot valve will only allow water to pass through it in one direction and one direction only. Water cannot travel back down and out this screen once it's come through that foot valve. There's a poppet in here that seats. So when that pump shuts off, that poppet seats, and it'll hold that suction line full of water, right? It'll hold that suction line full of water. The screen, obviously, is there to eliminate any particulate that could possibly get into the pump, into the nozzle, or into the impeller area. So that's a foot valve is going to be on the bottom of all above ground pumps that's pulling water from, like I said, wells, cisterns, lakes. Now I got a little confession to make. A little while ago, I said there's two types of jet pumps, shallow well and deep well. And that's true. However, the deep well jet pumps are oftentimes referred to as convertible jets. And the reason that they call them convertible jets is I can take this pump pictured on the left-hand side of your screen, and I could bolt a shallow well jet up to that pump, right? I could bolt a shallow well jet up to that pump, and in so doing, I created a shallow well jet pump. Or I could take that same pump, send it out the door with a deep well jet, and now that one, upon installation, will become a deep well jet pump. So it's called a convertible pump because it can be used either as a deep or shallow well application. In markets where we have customers that have both applications, they have both shallow and deep well applications, they really like the notion of a convertible pump because they can stock one pump, but yet stock both these jet assemblies, and it reduces the inventory, and it allows them to have the flexibility to send that pump out and either operate off a shallow well or a deep well. All right, so that's kind of referred to as a convertible. Now, there are also just shallow well only jet pumps, and we've got a lot of customers that, I think of down in the Carolinas, down around Charleston, I think. There's a lot of jet pumps down there, and every one of them is a shallow well. Their water table is very shallow, and so they really, their overwhelming jet pump sales are all shallow well jet pumps. So in addition to the convertible that can be used as shallow well or deep well, there are options to go straight up shallow well pumps. And so with a straight up shallow well pump, this jet or this ejector that you see here is actually an integral part of that pump casting. All right, it doesn't come on and off like this one. It's going to be on there. So that can only be used as a shallow well pump. You'll see the little clean out plug in the front that we talked about. So that allows you to get in and clean that nozzle out. But those are straight up shallow well pumps. So again, when we look at the difference between a shallow well pump or a deep well pump, we could say that a shallow well pump is going to be used a single pipe system, right? One pipe running to the water source. And it's going to be used on applications where the water is less than 25 feet away from the pump. These ejectors, whether it's this shallow well or the deep well that goes down into the well, they are limited on how much lift or how much suction they produce. So therefore, that's why we have the difference between the two. And when we talk about that lift here, all right, so, when I asked you to tell me how far is it down to the water source, whether is it less than 25 feet or is it more than 25 feet? That's what I'm talking about, this water source here. I'm not sure if this is the right slide to bring this conversation in on, but one day when I was in classroom, I got called out on this. A contractor looked at me and he said, "No, wait a minute." He says, "That 25 feet you told us about, did I understand that you're only measuring down to the water level? That's it?" I said, "Yes, sir. That's all. I just want to know what's the distance. If you had an imaginary line come out from that shallow well pump, I'm only concerned about the vertical distance, not the horizontal, just the vertical distance. And yes, I only want you to go down to the water level." He said, "But time out. That pump is getting its water through that foot valve." "Yes, you're right, sir. It is getting that water through that foot valve. What's your point?" He said, "Well, if you're bringing the water in down here and that foot valve can be several feet below the water level. Why aren't you measuring from down here where the water's actually coming into that suction pipe? I think this is the way I got past that answer or that question. I said, sir, if you had a glass of water and you filled it full, and you take a straw and you throw it down in that glass of water, let me ask you a question. Where's the water level inside that straw? And he looked at me and he said, well, it's at the same level it is in the glass. I said, you're exactly right. So when you put this suction pipe down into this well, think of it as a straw and think of it as going into a glass, because the water will come through that foot valve and it'll seek the level inside that suction pipe that will be equal to the water level that's in the well. And sir, when you start to draw that beverage or that water out of that glass, it's already this far up in the straw. So you're only having to lift it this distance here. So when we talk about this distance from the top down to the water level, that for an above ground pump, that's going to be referred to as lift. All right, lift. That pump has to lift the water before it can pump it. Next Wednesday, when we do the House of Resistance, lift is going to be a big part of that conversation. All right, so moving on. With a deep well, again, you've got two pipes running to the water source, and here again is going to be your deep well jet that's going to be located down in that well somewhere. But a deep well jet can bring water up from a depth of, quite frankly, 90 feet, I believe, is a bit conservative. I think we've got deep well jet pumps here capable of lifting water 100, 110 feet. All right, but it's going to use a deep well jet to make that all happen. So a deep well jet obviously is going to be referred to as a two-pipe system, and it'll also be referred to as more than 25 feet. All right, so there's two differences between the shallow well and the deep well jets. And with a visual look at those pumps sitting across the room, you ought to be able to tell whether there's two pipes coming out the front or just one. All right, let's move on to the second type of above ground pumps, and these are referred to as centrifugal pumps. So we're talking about centrifugal pumps now, and guess what? There's two types of those as well, but we'll get into that in a second. Oh, yeah, we're going to get into it right now. All right, so there are two types of centrifugal pumps. The pump that's pictured on the left-hand side of the screen is referred to as a straight centrifugal. The pump on the right-hand side of the screen, that pump's referred to as a self-priming pump. Sometimes those are called lawn sprinkling pumps, this pump over here on the right, okay? So those are the two types of centrifugals. Straight centrifugal and a self-primer. I guess let's talk about centrifugal just for a second. Centrifugal force. Everybody, I think, understands what centrifugal force is all about. It's a spinning action, right? So this impeller is going to be on the motor shaft, and this inside of a pump, this thing's rotating at the same rate that the motor rotates, which is about 3,450 RPMs. So it's moving very, very quickly inside that pump. And we all know that with a spinning action, it wants to throw everything to the outside. In fact, if you want a good little chuckle tonight when you get home, go on YouTube. And once you get on YouTube, just put in two search words: merry-go-round and motorcycle. Or you can go motorcycle and merry-go-round. But you're going to pull up some videos. And these young boys come into this little children's playground, and they get on a merry-go-round, two of them, and they sit across adjacent each other on this merry-go-round. And they're all cool and doing their thing, and then their third buddy comes over and takes his motorcycle, lays it on the ground, and engages the rear wheel with the bottom of that merry-go-round. And so the rubber tire with that metal ring on the bottom of the merry-go-round created a little friction. When they throttled it up, they thought I think they invented sliced bread or something, but they were pretty amazed that merry-go-round would spin with that motorcycle, and they got a little bold, and they asked him to go ahead and throttle it on up. And I'll stop there. No spoiler alert, but I will say that those two got to experience centrifugal force in a very personal way, because that spinning action wants to throw everything to the outside. We've all seen this before on weather reports, right? I mean, this is a satellite view of a hurricane. Again, this gives a great example of centrifugal action. As this hurricane spins and spins and intensifies, the cloud formation moves further away from that little black dot in the center. They keep moving further away as that hurricane intensifies. And I also have asked this. I said, hey, guys, you see that little black dot in the middle of that hurricane? Yep. Don't they have a name for that? And of course, everybody knows that. And the guy says, well, yeah, that's called the eye of the hurricane. I said, you're exactly right. That's the eye of the hurricane. Just like this is the eye of the impeller. This is where the water coming from your water source is going to go into. It's going to go into the eye of that impeller. And as that impeller is spinning at 3,450 RPMs, as that water comes into the eye and that impeller spinning, just like what we've talked about, it's going to throw all that water to the outside, right? That's what that impeller is. You can see all these veins that are in that inside of that impeller. So it's going to direct that water and it's going to throw it under a lot of velocity to the outside perimeter of that impeller. Of course, when this is in a pump, that water is going to come right out and travel right out the discharge. All right. A centrifugal pump is probably one of the simplest pumps that we manufacture here at Flint & Walling. It's simply an impeller that's put on a motor shaft, and then we rotate it like you see here inside of a pump housing. When it comes to these impellers, you do have a choice with some of the Flint & Walling pumps. You have a choice between a thermal injection molded plastic impeller like you see on the left, or you can have the option of going with a no-lead bronze impeller like you see on the right. We manufacture the plastic impellers. We have a company in southern Indiana that we own that is a plastic injection molder. So most all the plastic components that you will see in a Flint & Walling pump are self-manufactured. All right, we don't source those things out. But I will tell you this, the injection molded plastic is a very, very precise method of molding plastic material. If you run 1,000 of these, you will create 1,000 clones that are absolutely identical of one another. On the other hand, with the no-lead bronze impeller, if you choose go that option, a little different here, right? These impellers we need to balance. And so this is a 100% process that takes place here at Flint & Walling. There is not a bronze impeller that comes through this building that hadn't been on that axle. And so what they'll do is they'll put this on an axle, very much like balancing a tire. Strobe light comes on. This operator is fairly skilled because they'll know exactly where adjustments need to be made. I tell people all the time, you know, if you had a truck and you went out and bought a set of new tires for that truck, you would be a fool not to have those tires balanced at that time, right? Because we all know what can happen when a tire's out of balance. You're going to get excessive vibration, you're going to get excessive shaking, and chances are you're going to wear something else out unless you get that fixed. And so with a tire, we will add weight to that tire to bring it into balance. With an impeller, we do just the opposite, all right? So when this impeller needs to be brought into balance, they'll take it off the axle. Now you're looking at the eye side of this impeller, just like over here on the left-hand side. That's the eye side. But what they'll do is they'll take this impeller off and walk it over to a grinding wheel that's right next door, and they'll grind some material off the back side of the impeller, off this back side here. So if you ever see a Flint & Walling impeller that's got grind marks on the back side of the impeller, I had one guy want me to take one back one day. He said, somebody deliberately, maliciously just ground the crap out of this impeller. I told him, I said, that's how we balance those things. That's a good thing to see, not a bad thing. And so he got a little lesson on balancing impellers that day. But you will see scuff marks on the back of that impeller where we'll take some material off to bring that impeller into balance. And something else to be aware of when it comes to these centrifugal pumps. The more impellers that we put in these centrifugal pumps, the more pressure that pump will produce. Now, the jet pumps that we talked about a little while ago, those will all have just one impeller. But when we get into these like straight centrifugals, they can have more than one impeller. And these impellers that we put into these centrifugals are oftentimes referred to as stages. An impeller and a stage, those two terms are interchangeable. So you can have a single stage pump, you can have a two-stage pump, you can have a three-stage pump. Sometimes people call multiple stage or multiple stage pumps. I had a irrigation contract, a distributor come up to me after a class one day and said, "Mr. Payne, I learned something today." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I didn't know they called impellers stages." I said, "Yeah, that's what they're referred to as." He said, "Well, that explains then why I've got these pumps in my warehouse, and one of them says multi-stage, one of them says single stage. I didn't know what they were talking about." He said, "But now I do." So they're in. And then I get this question asked sometimes: where would you use a single stage pump versus a two or a three stage? When would that happen? All right. Well, look at the top of the screen. The more impellers, the more pressure that pump's going to produce. So when would you need more than one impeller? I'll give you an example. You got a little pump sitting down there at the very bottom of your screen, all right? That's a straight centrifugal down there. I had to highlight him in yellow for you to even see it. But what if that little pump sitting down there had to provide water to the house that's at the top of that hill? And they got an irrigation system out there on the backside. In other words, elevation, right? If this pump has to overcome elevation, and we have that in a lot of geographic parts of this country where they've got to go uphill. You better have a pump that's got the ability to produce enough pressure to get the water all the way up to the top of that hill, and yet enough pressure left over to adequately operate the irrigation system. And so to accomplish that, we add impellers. And by adding impellers, we give that pump an ability to pump more and more pressure. With a single stage, typically you're not going to have much elevation to overcome because that pump won't produce the pressure to get it up the hill. So you're going to be relatively flat, like we are here in northern Indiana where I live. All right? We sell a lot of single stage pumps up here because guess what? We don't have a lot of hills, right? I can remember my dog ran away when I was 9 years old. I could still look out there 3 days later and see him. I mean, he's out there a long way, just a little black speck, but that's how flat we are. So we sell a lot of single stage pumps in areas where the terrain is relatively flat. But when we get into elevation changes and that type of thing, terrain changes, that's when we look at, multiple impellers to create that pressure to get up that hill. So what's on your screen now is a three-stage pump, right? There's 3 impellers in this pump, as you can see right here. In fact, I had this pump at a irrigation show, and it was sitting on a table. That pump that you're looking at, the cutaway, and I had it sitting on my little display table. And when they opened up this little convention or whatever you want to call it, open house, the contractors come in, and I had a contractor walk over to my little table, and he looked at that pump, and I thought this dude was going to wet his pants. I mean, I say that figuratively, but he looked at that thing and he pointed at those impellers. He goes, "Those are brass impellers." Are you telling me something I didn't know? I mean, yes, I understand they're brass impellers. Why are you so excited about those? He goes, "Well, I didn't think any pump company sold pumps with bronze impellers anymore. Everybody's went to plastic." I said, "Well, we have both. We have the plastic impellers, excuse me, a little more competitive in price, but we started out with these bronze impellers." He said, "I think this can solve a problem I'm having." I said, "Well, now, what kind of problem you having?" He said, "There's a lake north of us, big lake up here called Lake Geneva." He said, "There are houses all around that lake, and they all pull water out of the lake for irrigation, and I have a lot of centrifugal pumps on that lake. They're not yours, but I'm going to tell you the problem I'm having. Every season," that's what he called it, season, he said, "I got to go out and replace all those plastic impellers and dang near every one of those pumps." I go, "You're kidding." He goes, "No." And he said, "There's been an occasion I've had to go out twice." I go, "What's going on?" He said, the impellers are in shreds. They're just shredded to pieces." And I looked at him and I said, "Dude, something's causing that." He goes, "Oh, I know exactly what's causing it." And I said, "Well, what's causing it?" He said, "A shell about the size of your little fingernail." I said, "Like a seashell?" "Yeah." I said, "Wait a minute. You say it's the size of the fingernail on my little finger?" Yes, sir. He said, they get in that pump, and he said, as that pump turns and it grinds all those shells up, he said, that becomes extremely abrasive, and it just shreds my impellers all to pieces. And I said, this doesn't make sense to me. Let me ask you a question. He said, what's that? I said, you're pulling this out of a lake. He said, yes. I said, do you have a foot valve on that suction line that you've got going out in that lake? He goes, of course I do. I said, well, that foot valve should have a screen on it. He said, it sure does. I said, well, that screen doesn't have openings as big as my little fingernail, so you tell me how something that large is getting through that screen. He said, it's coming through as larva. I said, what? He said, it's coming through as larva. And then when it gets into the pump, and if that pump sits idle for any length of time, he said, that pump body actually becomes a breeding ground for that larva to reproduce and multiply, and they eventually become something we've all heard of called zebra mussels. And so he said, I imagine those brass impellers will hold up to those zebra mussels a lot better than those plastic impellers. Yes? And I said, hey, we've done a lot of destructive tests at Flint and Walling. We've run this pump dry for 12 hours. We've deadheaded it for 30 minutes. We've run sand and everything you can imagine through it, sir, but not one time did we ever run shells through it. So I can't tell you that the bronze impellers are going to do any better than those plastic ones. But I would tell you this, if I had your track record, I think I'd be willing to roll the dice. And so a year later, I see this guy at the same show. My memory's such that if my wife wants me to pick up a gallon of milk on the way home, my garage door opening up will be my reminder. But this guy, I remembered him from a year. I was at the same show. He comes up, he's bopping around, and you remember me? I said, not only do I remember you, I'll recite your story. So we got to talking a little bit. I said, so what'd you do? He said, I replaced those pumps with yours. And I said, you did you? He said, yes, sir. I said, so what's the verdict? And he kind of held his fingers up in the form of a zero and clicked his lips and said, nothing. Never had to go out on one. So I suppose there's some advantages of the bronze over the plastic. But folks, it's not in performance. It's not in performance. That plastic impeller is going to deliver as much water, as much pressure as the bronze. So you're not getting more water. You're not getting more pressure with the bronze impeller. From people ask me, they said, well, is it as reliable as the bronze? Well, in my opinion, it is. Our warranty return rate on this whole thing is less than 0.4%. And we don't have a spike on plastic impellers. So, yeah, I'd say that the plastic impellers are out there lasting just as long as the bronze. Well, then why do you offer both? Because there's parts of the country where, I go down to West Texas, and the guy's got a belt buckle the size of a license plate, and he tells me, I want brass. And I said, okay, you're going to get bronze impellers. So it really boils down to a choice, is really what it boils down to. But it's a choice that we offer. So moving on, again, with these straight centrifugals, I'm down to about 15 minutes left. As I mentioned before, they're the simplest of all pumps. However, those impellers that we looked at, whether they're plastic or whether they're bronze, one thing to always keep in mind about pump impellers, and that's this. They will not remove air, all right? They're not like a fan blade. They don't move air. So all these pumps have to be primed with water before operation, before we fire them up, and they have to stay full of water all the time. And so that's called priming a pump. Now we switch over to this second category of centrifugal pumps. They're referred to as self-primers, right? So let's look at the bullets there. Self-priming pumps are oftentimes referred to as lawn sprinkling pumps. I think I mentioned that earlier. But here's the important bullet. Although they are, air quotes, self-priming, all pumps, and all means all, and that's all means, all pumps need to be primed initially in order to pump water, including the self-priming pump, Now, when we look at these two pumps, why is it called self-priming? Let's look at these two pumps. There's your straight centrifugal, and there's your self-priming pump. Look at your visual difference. On a straight centrifugal, and maybe this is the reason they call it that, I don't know, but when the water comes from the water source right here into the suction port right here, that water will go straight into the eye of that impeller. Maybe that's why they call that a straight centrifugal. But look at the self-priming centrifugal on the right-hand side. Look where that suction port's at. Oh, no, it's not in the center. It's way up high. See it way up here? It's way up high, almost where the discharge is located. So why do they call this a self-primer if in fact it needs to be primed initially? Well, let's just run a quick scenario. Let's suppose that this straight centrifugal were hooked up on an irrigation system, okay? And for whatever reason, a leak developed in the irrigation system, and it literally drained the system down to zero pressure overnight or over the weekend. Pump wasn't called to run, and so the whole system drains down. I suppose it's conceivable that the water could possibly drain down to the very lower portion of this suction port here. Now, water inside that pump below that yellow dash line is going nowhere. There's no way for it to get out unless you take this drain plug out down here at the bottom. It's going to retain that much water inside that pump, but that much of the impeller is exposed, right? So it's not going to pump. So what's going to happen with the straight centrifugal is you're going to have to find the leak, fix it, and then reprime the pump in order to get it up and running again. Same thing happens over here on the right-hand side with the self-priming pump. We primed it all up. We fired it up on day one, but now we're a year in or 2 years in, and that leak develops somewhere, and that system drains down to zero pressure, and the whole system drains down. What happens on that self-primer? Well, I'll answer that. That water will drain down to that level. All right? It can't come out at anywhere below that. Again, unless you take this drain plug out, that water is going to be retained inside that pump body, which also means that impeller is fully submerged in water, which means you find the leak, fix it, and fire the pump up. You don't have to prime the pump a second time. That's where it gets its name, self-primer. But they all need to be primed initially. Speaking of priming a pump, just real quick, the biggest thing, advice I could give on priming a pump is have a measure of patience. All right, have a measure of patience. So let's look at this pump here. You see where the suction's at. You see where the discharge comes out. Now, some pumps, not all, but some pumps you will find will have what's called a dedicated priming port. Okay, so if this happens to be a shallow well jet pump right here, right? We can identify that pump now. And so if I'm going to prime this pump up, I'm going to get rid of that plug, and I'm going to put a funnel in there, and I'm going to pour water into that pump. I want to fill that pump body up. I want to fill that suction line up with water. And in the process, I want to allow time to let the air purge itself out of the water line, out of the suction line. I need to allow time for that air to purge out of there. I'll tell you something else on our jets, especially this shallow well ejector here, and you're going to see this on some of our other pumps as well. We'll put a plug up here at the top, and it may be here, as you can see. But if you take that plug out, you'll find that pump will prime quicker because, it gives an additional place for that air to vent and get out of there. But that would be if a pump has a dedicated priming port. All right. If it doesn't, now here's one of our centrifugal pumps. There's a plug right there. If you take that out, it'll prime quicker. So that's just a priming plug. But here's the discharge. All right. There's no priming port up here. So anytime you have a pump that does not have a dedicated priming port, I would strongly encourage that on the discharge side of that pump, you incorporate a T. So the water coming out of the pump then can come up into this T and then run on into the service. And I'm going to put a plug on the top of that T. I'm going to put a little plug in there. So now I have a place to prime this pump. Should this pump have to go down, in that first scenario, if that pump went down because the water drained out of it, I can go out now if I installed it this way, and I can remove this little air plug here, take that out. You can prime this without doing that, but it makes it easier if you do. And I can remove this plug, and I've now got access where I can go ahead and put water in there without removing the discharge pipe. So that's why pretty good recommendation to go ahead and install a T on the discharge side of that pump. And again, when priming a pump, we want to allow time for all that air to get purged out of there. So it's not just a matter of filling that pump body up with water, but if you want to prime a pump properly, you'll also make sure that that suction line gets full of water and that you have allowed time for all the air bubbles to dissipate up out of this pump body and the suction pipe. That way you've got a fully primed pump. So air pockets and bubbles must be eliminated during this process. This is a generic topic right now. I'm saying any brand of pump, you need to do it this way. All jets, all centrifugal pumps need to be initially primed with water in order to remove air from the pump and the pipe. And failure to do this properly is probably the number one cause for initial pump failure, just improper priming. We didn't allow enough time for the air to purge out. And so we thought we had it full, it started pumping, and then all of a sudden here comes a big old slug of air, and it gets in that pump body, and it takes that impeller out of the water. And all of a sudden, boop, it quits pumping, right? We need to make sure we get it all primed up properly. Well, folks, we're at the end of today. I'm looking at the clock. We're ending a few minutes early, but I do appreciate your attention or your attendance today. If you get a chance to fill out the survey, feel free. And I do, if this is your first virtual training event, I'd like to welcome you. If you've been here before, I'd like to welcome you back. And I'd also like to be able to talk to you more next Wednesday when we go into the House of Resistance. With that, this web conference has officially ended. Please travel safe and be safe. Thank you very much.